What if one of Hollywood's most famous deaths wasn't a tragedy, but a message? What if behind the glamour, there was a web of power, secrets, and people who couldn't afford silence to break? On August 5, 1962, the world was told a simple story. Marilyn Monroe died of a probable suicide. Case closed. But the problem is, the questions never stopped. Even decades later, doubt still lingers. Was Marilyn Monroe silenced, and was the mafia somehow involved? Let's pull back the curtain. The official story, and why it never felt complete. Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Brentwood home at just 36 years old. The official ruling stated a probable suicide caused by an overdose of barbiturates. On the surface, it seemed tragically believable. She had struggled with insomnia for years, relying heavily on sleeping pills. Her life, despite its glamour, was filled with emotional turbulence, failed relationships, and intense pressure from Hollywood studios. There had even been previous overdoses, reinforcing the narrative that this was a continuation of a long, painful pattern. But almost immediately, something felt off. Details didn't align neatly. The scene raised questions. The timeline felt inconsistent. People close to her began offering accounts that didn't perfectly match. Small gaps appeared, nothing definitive, nothing provable, but enough to make the story feel less like a conclusion and more like a draft that had been rushed to print. And in mysteries like this, it's not always what's there that matters. Sometimes, it's what's missing. The dangerous circle Marilyn was moving in. To understand why alternative theories exist at all, you have to understand where Marilyn Monroe stood in the final months of her life. She wasn't just a Hollywood icon anymore. She had moved into a different orbit, one filled with influence, access, and power. She was linked, at least according to multiple accounts, to President John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert F. Kennedy. Whether those relationships were exaggerated, misunderstood, or real in any meaningful way is still debated. But the perception alone mattered. Because Robert Kennedy, as Attorney General, was aggressively pursuing organized crime at the time, the mafia was under pressure. Investigations were tightening. Powerful figures were being watched more closely than ever before. Now place Marilyn Monroe in the middle of that environment. A globally recognized celebrity, allegedly close to political power, possibly exposed to private conversations or sensitive information. Even if only a fraction of that was true, it creates a scenario where she becomes more than just a star. She becomes someone who exists at the intersection of entertainment and politics, a place where influence can turn into risk very quickly. And in that kind of world, risk doesn't always get ignored. The birth of the mafia murder theory. The idea that the mafia might have been involved in Marilyn Monroe's death didn't appear overnight. It didn't dominate headlines in 1962. In fact, it grew slowly, years later, as writers, investigators, and conspiracy theorists began revisiting the case. By the 1970s and 1980s, books and alternative investigations started suggesting a different possibility. One where Monroe wasn't simply a victim of her own struggles, but of forces far more calculated. One of the most repeated claims centered around mob boss Sam Giancana. The theory suggested that Monroe had become a liability, someone who knew too much, spoke too freely, or posed a potential threat to powerful individuals. According to some versions of the story, her connections, real or perceived, to the Kennedys placed her in a position where she could unintentionally expose sensitive information. Others claim she may have been used as a link between political figures and organized crime, whether knowingly or not. In these narratives, the mafia's involvement isn't random. It's strategic, controlled, purposeful. But here's the critical point. These claims rely heavily on interpretation, not confirmed evidence. They exist in a space between possibility and imagination, which is exactly why they continue to captivate people. The Red Diary, mystery or myth? Every enduring mystery seems to orbit around one object, something symbolic, something missing, something that could supposedly explain everything if it were ever found. For Marilyn Monroe, that object is often described as a little red diary. According to various accounts, this diary allegedly contained personal notes about her relationships, conversations with influential figures, and potentially sensitive information tied to politics and power. The idea is simple. If the diary existed and contained what people claim, it could have been explosive. But there's a problem. No verified version of this diary has ever been produced. No confirmed evidence proves its existence beyond anecdotal claims. It has never been officially logged, recovered, or authenticated, which creates an interesting tension. If it never existed, then it's a myth, one that conveniently fills gaps in the story. If it did exist and disappeared, then its absence becomes the most suspicious detail of all. Either way, the diary adds fuel to the narrative, even if it adds no concrete proof. Motive, power, and speculation. When people try to connect the mafia to Monroe's death, they often focus on motive. Not evidence, motive. Because motive is easier to imagine than to prove. The theory suggests that if Monroe had knowledge that could damage powerful figures, she might have been seen as a threat. Alternatively, if she was perceived as emotionally unstable and unpredictable, that threat might have seemed even greater. In this framework, the mafia isn't acting out of chaos, it's acting out of control, eliminating risk, protecting interests, sending signals. But again, this remains speculation. There is no verified documentation, no confirmed order, no direct link tying organized crime to her death. What exists instead is a narrative built from connections, timing, and the kind of logic that feels convincing, even when it isn't conclusive. The versions that go too far. Some variations of the theory go even further, describing detailed scenarios involving forced entry, staged overdoses, or elaborate cover-ups designed to make the death appear like suicide. These versions are often the most dramatic and the least supported. They rely on unverified witness statements, inconsistent testimonies, and reconstructions that were created long after the fact. Over time, these stories have been repeated, reshaped, and sometimes exaggerated, blurring the line between investigation and storytelling. And while they make for compelling narratives, they highlight an important truth about this case. The more detailed the theory becomes, the less evidence there tends to be behind it. Why the theory refuses to die. So why, after more than 60 years, does the mafia theory still exist? Because the official explanation, while supported by evidence, feels emotionally incomplete to many people. It's difficult to reconcile the image of Marilyn Monroe, the symbol of beauty, fame, and cultural impact, with a quiet, tragic end. The human mind searches for something bigger, something more meaningful, something that transforms the story into more than just loss. And conspiracy theories provide that. They turn tragedy into strategy. They turn uncertainty into intention. They turn a personal struggle into a global mystery. In a strange way, they keep her story alive, not as it was, but as people wish it had been. The reality behind the mystery. When you strip away the speculation, what remains is far less dramatic, but far more human. Marilyn Monroe lived under immense pressure. She battled insomnia, relied heavily on medication, and navigated a life where privacy barely existed. Her relationships were complicated, her career was demanding, and her emotional world was far from stable. Yes, she was connected to powerful people. Yes, her life intersected with politics and influence. But those facts alone don't confirm a larger conspiracy. What they do show is that she lived in a world where perception and reality often blurred, and where even the smallest details could take on massive significance. The truth no one likes. Here's the uncomfortable truth. There is no solid, verifiable evidence that the mafia killed Marilyn Monroe. At the same time, there are enough unanswered questions, inconsistencies, and lingering doubts to ensure that the conversation never fully ends. And maybe that's the real reason this story still matters. Because it exists in that rare space where certainty and mystery collide, where facts are present but not satisfying, where the official story explains everything but doesn't feel like it explains enough. And in that space, the human mind does what it always does. It keeps searching. And maybe that's what makes this story so haunting, not just how she died, but why the questions never stopped. If you want more hidden stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe.